So when you're having this conversation about finding your space, there's a few things you can think of. What are you going to organize around? Turf, geography, right? Issues, identity, workplaces. And this isn't a question that you answer one time and continue on, right? This is a constant question that we should be asking ourselves. Oops. Michael Shin had asked, what about local parties serving as shadow government, building dual power, organizing the founding of co-ops, and building economic power that way? Absolutely, right? So in the beginning, and this kind of strategic thing should be something you're doing regularly. We're talking about it right at the beginning. But when you do when you're having these conversations, those are the kinds of things you should be asking, right? If you don't think you're ready to run a candidate that can actually challenge and have a serious campaign, then you can dive into issue organizing, right? If you're like me, I live in a state capital, and a few months ago, my brother-in-law asked me to help organize the food service place that he was working in. So I reached out to union folks I knew. Again, this is a state capital. Every single major union is here, right? They have offices here. They've got staff here. And what I was told by the, former president of our Trades and Labor Council was that no one in town was organizing service workers. Not one of them. The staff that they have in town is for lobbying, right? It's not for doing the work. So if you've got members who are, working in the service industry and want to dive into this, absolutely, right? I'll kind of warn that service industry organizing is huge, right? And just like everything else we've talked about, it's going to be, you and your ragtag group against a multinational, multi-million or billion-dollar corporation, right? But these are the questions you need to ask yourself, right? As you're starting to organize and as you continue to organize, right? Are we organizing in a specific geographic area, right? For instance, in my neighborhood, I probably have the most active neighborhood association in town. There's not that much space for me to generally just start organizing on city issues in my neighborhood because there's already a spokesperson in my neighborhood. There's already an official outlet in my neighborhood. On the other hand, I know from participating that my neighborhood association very much excludes renters. So there's a big opening for a tenants union in my neighborhood, right? And that we can, and that's getting into, a turf and an issue. So there's crossover. This is intersectional, right? So think about your community, do research, right? Look into, your city's budget and see where you can start raising things, see where there's money that you might be able to have redirected. And then another important, when you're doing this kind of thinking, I really like this structure that Lee Staples had where you ask who wants what from whom and how can it be accomplished, right? Because if we want to change, if we're coming up with an issue to organize, it's because we want to change things, right? So who are we, right? Who's our membership, our structure, our leadership as staff? How, and democratically come to the decision that what do you want, right? What do we want? What do we want to change? And then you need to think about, and this is where, going back into, reverse power mapping and issues-oriented power mapping comes into play, right? If you're organizing heavily, you could very well be power mapping pretty regularly, right? Not just the kind of, who do you know that we talked about, but then later doing issues-oriented mapping where how do we get to the city councilors that we need to move, right? How do we get who lives in their neighborhoods, right? Because me emailing a city council person from across the city from me, they have no reason to care about what I have to say. I'm not their constituent, right? But what 12 people in the neighborhood that do care about this do I know? What 20 people, what 30 people, what 100 people? And they can then start emailing. And another thing about local offices too, right? You show, in my town of 100,000, you show up with a dozen people to a city council meeting, you're now the loudest voice in the room, right? You show up with 100, they can't fit you. And they're going to have to deal with that, right? How do they vote against something when the room's full of people and it's standing room only in the hall yelling for them not to do it? Now they have to consider their constituencies. Now they have to consider the voice of the people. But if you're not showing up, right? If you're not organizing people there, they don't know. If you're not flooding their inboxes before the meeting, they don't know. So who wants what from whom and how can it be accomplished is a great way to think about, how to start actual organizing. After you've kind of had the larger brainstorm of, turf, issue, identity, and workplace organizing conversations. So this is the initial early work, right, that core group's going to do. Having these conversations and democratically coming to these, positions and decisions.
Yeah, hey, Chris, I wanted to throw in real quick there. One strategy I think folks in Pittsburgh were following is that these organizing questions should be dynamic. They should be adaptable to what's going on and how the conditions are changing. Maybe suddenly a new issue comes up and it's very important, and you might want to switch tactics. It could be that you tried some tactic and it worked really well, and maybe you want to do that more. Maybe it didn't work as well as you thought and you want to change it. So you should always ask, as part of this, as you go, if things can change. And related to that is that also don't feel very stuck either, that when you start this, you can change it as you go. Don't feel like you have to be stuck in any one particular organizing space or issue or whatever it is when you get started. Just pick something to get started with. And what we saw in Pittsburgh, for example, was in terms of turf, in terms of geography, the city and the county is very big and very dense in the inner city, and then the rest of the county is actually fairly spread out among. Rural would be a little bit too extreme, but what would you call it? Like suburban, exurban, something like that. Communities. So there's actually a lot of variation in the communities just in my county. So what we did was we focused on some issues. We focused on things like fracking to get more to get more attention to that issue and to our organization, to the Green Party. And as more people came in looking to learn more about that situation, we could track members and we could group and we could say, hey, we saw that like 10 of you seem like you live in the same neighborhood. How about you create a smaller neighborhood committee, and you could start looking at candidates in your neighborhood that will fit your issues that may not fit the rest of the county, so that as a county level local party, we're looking at issues together, but then we kind of have sub-locals, right? These neighborhood groups that can do things like recruit candidates and look a little bit more seriously at the kind of tactics that Chris is talking about, that you can flood that particular town's town hall meeting with residents of that community, now that you have a base of like 10 people there. But we got those 10 people together initially by starting as an issue organizing group. So, that's something to consider, that I think the turf organizing in terms of a local party is important for running candidates, because obviously you have a certain district, a geographic district you need to run in. But before you get there, you might want to start with something like an issue or a workplace organizing effort to start to get to know people before you consider those campaigns.
Yeah, the adaptability thing, it's absolutely key, right? The thing that pops to my mind is that my local was going to organize an event around the March for Medicare for All. And so, we were plotting for it, we were getting ready for it, and then Roe happened. And I'm sure that my community is not alone when I say that all political action got sucked completely into Roe, right? It was the elephant in the room, and it took over, and there really was no space for any other organizing right there for a minute while people were, responding to the falling of Roe. So we had to pivot, right? We actually dropped the event because even the other organizations that we were working with were like, we can't focus on this right now, right? We're organizing, and most of them were Democratic Party oriented, right? So they very much jumped into the Roe and voting is the solution. So you've got to be able to pivot, and a lot of times it's not in your control, kind of what makes you pivot. So we've got to be very, very adaptable.